welcome back. Let's walk through the challenge now. To walk through the challenge and to take the challenge, you want to open the O2 file, the .ipynb file, and that should open right up in Azure Data Studio for you. So you see we've got this markdown at the top. What this file is if you double click on something, you can actually edit it, and you can see that what I've done is some markdown language to put in the title, some instructions, and then each problem has a number. In the cells for each problem, this is actually runnable code in Azure Data Studio. So this challenge number 1 is to make the TSQL for this index statement rerunnable. So if I press run cell here, which is also F5, it will run all of the code in this cell. Now I haven't connected to anything yet, right? I say, hey, I want to run this, and it's like, well, where do you want to run it? I'm going to go ahead and connect to that instance where I installed Northwind database. And the first time I run this command to create the non-clustered index, it does complete successfully. But the second time I run it, it says, oh, I cannot create this index because we already have an index or statistics. It is actually an index on the table dbo.customer. So your challenge is to make this rerunnable, but without dropping the index. Now, just to be clear, the only checks you have to do in this case, just check, does an index with this name exist on this table? You can assume if an index with that name exists on the table that it has the same schema. I realize that in a production environment, that is not always a safe assumption, but in this case, just to make it rerunnable, just check the name and the table. You do not have to check if it has the exact key columns and included column that is the same there. So there's a little space here for you to write and test your solution. And when you click the play button on the cell, it will run everything in that cell. Notice that conveniently, it does remember the connection I have. I only had to connect in that first cell. I don't have a different connection for every cell. It's going to stay connected to that same instance. Your second problem is to make this view creation statement rerunnable. And I want you to do it in 2 ways. And the challenge is to do it without using drop view. We want the view to still exist even as we rerun this. Now, when I run this the first time, I can create the view successfully. But if I just run this code again, I get an error that says, you're trying to create an object with a name that already exists. So we want to be able to rerun this time after time after time without dropping the view. Now, you might wonder, why is dropping the view a big deal? Well, if we drop the view and something's been granted permissions to this, we've cleared that all out. Also, it's just generally, this is one of the patterns that I was actually taught when I first started this. It's generally better to create something and then always alter it in your pattern. It's less confusing, and there's if something causes your command to fail or something happens, if the failure happens between those two commands somehow, because we do have to make create view the first statement in a batch. So if we had like a failure here and we had dropped, as the first step, we could actually end up somehow in a state, if we weren't, doing it all in a transaction, we could end up in a state where we had just dropped it and we hadn't created it. Now, of course, if we were doing it in a transaction, we wouldn't have that risk. But if we're doing a pattern where we are not dropping and recreating all the time, we don't even have to worry about that as much, and we have more options. So I think there's a couple, I don't think it's the biggest thing in the world, but I think it can be quite nice to just say, hey, we're always going to alter. We're never going to drop. But of course, we do have to have some, we can't just alter the first time. We do have to create the view somewhere. So the challenge is find a pattern where you have rerunnable code where you're not dropping the view. And you want this to be rerunnable in 2 ways. So because there's more than one way to do this, it turns out. So the first 2A is the challenge to write a pattern that will work all the way back to like SQL Server 2005. You do not have to install a SQL Server 2005 instance. The point here is that you want a pattern that works essentially before SQL Server 2016 SP1. We got a new way to do this in SQL Server 2016 SP1, which is fantastic. And if all of your instances are 2016 SP1 and higher, I would just always use that method. But a lot of us don't get to live in that world, so oftentimes we do need a pattern that works back to 2005. For problem 3, we have 2 drop table statements that we want to be rerunnable. Now, the first thing we do is we create the tables we're going to drop. So I'm not actually dropping tables that ship in Northwind. We're just creating 2 tables, drop me 1 and drop me 2. And your challenge is to make these drop commands rerunnable. So anytime you want to reset this, you don't have to recreate all of Northwind. You could just rerun the create table if you've already dropped them. So the first time I run this command, they drop successfully. The second time I do it, yeah, that doesn't work. So again, with this one, with the tables, you have a challenge to do this in a classic way, which works before SQL Server 2016. So it works on 2005, 2008, 2012, all of them before 2016. But I really love it. We also got a new way to do this one in SQL Server 2016, so you're challenged to use that pattern as well. Problem number 4 is a set of permission statements. You want this set of permission statements to be completely rerunnable with no errors. What we're doing is we are creating a new role. We're granting select on the DBO schema to that new role, and then we are creating a new user. Now I'm doing something a little bit weird here. I'm creating the new user without login. That is simply to make this easy to run on everyone's instance so that you don't have to go create a Windows login. And maybe not all of you are using a domain or anyway. So I'm creating it without login just for convenience and rerunability, right? To make it very simple. We then add new user to that role, and then we validate that everything's using. So we say, okay, we are going to impersonate that user. And then we run a little select just to verify that it is impersonating. And then we are going to select top 1 from dbo.customers. Now, one little tip, just realized I hadn't mentioned this tip. The way these cells work, at least presently in Jupyter Notebooks, this is evolving. Azure Data Studio, it's a relatively new product. It changes a lot over time. But the way it works right now is that if you highlight a certain part of a cell and you click this button, it is not going to run what you highlighted. What it says when you highlight this, it's going to run the entire cell, even if you've only highlighted part of it. So highlighting little bits of it isn't going to run just that little bit. It's going to still run the entire cell, even if you've just selected a bit. So let's run this the first time and test this. And I will zoom out a little bit there, or maybe not. Let's see if I can remember the command to zoom there. I think it's command minus. Yeah, I am zooming out there. We can see that all of these commands completed successfully. After I started impersonating that user, I was able to confirm. Here's the SID it's running under. And yes, I am acting as new user, and new user can select from this table that's in the DBO schema. But if I try to run this again now, I'm going to get some errors because it says the role, new role, already exists, and the user, new user, already exists. So I need to do some work to make those commands rerunnable, and there's some space for your solution down there. So take a crack at this. I'll see you in the next video to go through the solutions for this, which I've got, you already saw this, in another Jupyter